In the previous lesson, I showed you how we can use divs, and we're using divs fairly often to break apart our content. And there actually is a better way. So now with HTML5, we got the opportunity to have real, meaningful tagging using different sections, headers, footers, aside. So what they actually did is they went through websites, most of the more common used websites, they looked at what divs, and typically we would do something like header, to identify it as a div, that this div is a header, and we'd have a nav and so on. So what's happened now is that with HTML5 we have more semantic, meaningful tagging system. So for navigation we have nav, so this would create a navigation area. So maybe for this I'm going to update this div to a header, and we see that essentially these elements are going to be treated in the same way as typical divs would be, but it just gives us more opportunity to create more meaningful structure within our HTML. So we might have something over here where we have a section. So, and by all means you can still use divs, or you could break it apart in more meaningful fashion. So if we had section here, so I got to make sure I get the closing div. So sometimes when you're updating like this, it does get a little bit difficult to make sure that you're getting them all opening and closing. And then at the bottom here maybe would have a footer. And you can use these over and over again. So it doesn't mean that if you've already set a footer or if you've set a header that you don't need to add that in again. So you would see that this is used over and over again. So we might have a section, and that section might have a header and a footer as well. It might have some content. So it's all really up to you how you want to break that apart, that content. Always think about the way that you want to represent the content to the user, and try to think of it as a top-down level of sections and all the different containers of these elements and how they're fitting into each other. So our nav would be essentially a self-contained set, our code snippet that we've got, and we've got our unordered list. And sometimes you might have your nav inside of your header, so it might look something like this. And sometimes you might have a wrapper around that entire web page. So for this instance, this is where we would use a div again, because there really isn't a good element that you could use. So I would do something like this, where I would open and close the div. So instead of using the body tags to make the wrapper, I would use a div to wrap it. So this would be good if we're trying to restrict the size of the page. So I'm going to throw in a quick, some quick styling in here. So if we had a width of, so let's say I wanted my website to be only a width of 500 pixels. When I do the wrapper, I can really easily make this adjustment and have it sit at 500 or 300 pixels or whatever amount we want to set there. And this is why the rationale for using the different wrappers. And if you're reusing headers and sections, then you might need to identify them to really indicate which one you want to apply styling for. And we're going to, of course, go over that as we progress through the course. So also, you might want to break it apart in articles. And these are the more commonly used ones. And actually, it shouldn't be articles, it should just be article. So let's say we had a bunch of articles here. So we could further break apart our section. And this is in a more meaningful representation, and it'll make a lot more sense how you need to break up your content as you start adding and styling, because this is going to be the important part of how you're designing your website. So we might also have, instead of just two sections, so we might have a side menu as well. So this would be known as aside, or we might have three different sections, and we have our aside there, sidebar or side menu, so whatever you want to call it, and this is aside. And so this would typically float to the side, and we see that none of these really have a lot of built-in values into them, so built-in default properties. They're just essentially divs with a more meaningful name. So in the next lesson, we're going to take a quick look at how forms are created within web pages. So this is another typical HTML structure that you're going to find on websites. So we're going to take a look at building out forms from scratch in the next lesson.